Today's reading is from Mark chapter 12, 41. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only 2 cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty, in everything, all she had to live on." Amen.
Good morning, everyone. Today we're coming to the last in our series of the women that Jesus met. And you've read the passage which Susan read to us from Mark chapter 12. But there's actually no recorded conversation between Jesus and this lady. Did you notice in the reading that Jesus doesn't say anything to her? She doesn't say anything to him. Jesus spoke to his disciples, but not to her. So Tamlin very aptly called this series "He Saw Her," because Jesus didn't communicate with this lady. He saw her and he knew her. This incident is also recorded in Luke's Gospel in chapter 21, and again, it's a very short passage, gives us no more details about this lady, and again, there's no recorded conversation. Now, whether Jesus had talked to her on another occasion, another day, we don't know, but in this passage, he didn't talk to her, she didn't talk to him, but he saw her and he knew her. So today we're going to ask ourselves some questions about this lady. Who was she? Where was she? What did she do? And why did Jesus select this incident to be recorded in 2 of the Gospels and to be a teaching for his disciples, and ultimately, of course, for us as well as his disciples? Well, first of all, who was this lady? We don't know her name. We don't know how old she was. We can assume that she was maybe older, but we don't know. A lot of younger women can be widows as well. But only thing we know about her, because we don't know about her family and her background at all we know about her was that she was a widow and she was poor. She had very little money. And widows had a very special place in God's kingdom. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, we read about a special place that widows should have, the care that the children of Israel should take of them in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament we read the care that the church should take of widows. Just a few verses from the Old Testament. In Psalm 68 verse 5 it says, "God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows," a defender of widows. Psalm 146 verse 9 says, "The Lord sustains the fatherless and the widows." So the Lord sustains the orphans and the widows. And then in Proverbs 15:25, "The Lord tears down the house of the proud, but he sets the widow boundary stones in place." He protects the widow. Now there's many hundreds of references in the Old Testament to widows, and we could spend all day looking at them. We're not going to, don't worry. But there were 3 special groups of people that God cared for, who were seen as vulnerable. Firstly, there were the foreigners who were newcomers in the area. There were the orphans, or the fatherless as they're referred to in some of those readings, and the widows. These were 3 special groups of people that God was concerned about and wanted his people to be concerned about. In the New Testament, the church was instructed about looking after widows, those who were in need. James wrote in 1:27, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress." So James is encouraging his readers to look after not only orphans, children without parents, but widows as well. Now, not all widows were poor. Some of them may have come from very rich families and they had families who could look after them and support them. But if you didn't have a family with income to support you, you were in a pretty desperate situation in those days. There was no widow's pension, there was no Centrelink, no Medicare, none of those government benefits that we have today. So if you were a widow and you didn't have a family but that could support you, you were pretty desperate and you would be living on very basic provisions. In the Old Testament we read that farmers were encouraged to leave some of their crops that were being cultivated so the widows could come along and collect, a bit of leftover grapes, some leftover grapes or leftover corn or whatever. And that's pretty meagre provisions, isn't it, if that was your only income? So in the New Testament, when Paul wrote to Timothy, he instructed the church about what they should do in looking after widows who fitted a certain criteria. So not all widows needed to be looked after. Some of them had wealthy families who could look after them. But there was a provision for those who weren't. So 1 Timothy chapter 5, we read that the widow who's really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues to night and day to pray. And they're told that they should look after these people, give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn first of all to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents. For this is pleasing to God. So if a widow had family, children, grandchildren, they were the ones who were responsible to look after her. But if you didn't have that, there was a list. It talks about a list when Timothy receives this letter, and it seems like the list was some sort of pastoral list. So widows who couldn't provide for themselves or couldn't be provided for by their family were put on this list, and the church were responsible to look after them. A bit later on in that chapter in 1 Timothy, it says, no widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60. So presumably younger widows could, earn themselves some money. So she had to be over 60. She had to have been faithful to her husband and be known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the saints, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kind of good deeds. So there was provision in the New Testament church for widows to be looked after. But remember, this lady who went into the temple in the time of Jesus, this was before the church was established. So those provisions of a pastoral list in the church to look after widows hadn't yet been established. So this widow was poor and she possibly didn't have family to look after her. Well, where was this widow? So we know who she was, we know about her, we don't know who she was, but where was she? She was in the temple. She'd gone there to give her offering, and she'd probably gone there to pray as well. And the temple was divided into several courts. So first of all, there was the outer court where the Gentiles could go and pray, and that would include us as non-Jews, that only the Jewish people went further into the temple, but the Gentiles, the non-Jews, could just pray in the outer court. And that, of course, was the area where Jesus found the traders selling things and not allowing the people to pray. So we read that in another passage. The next court along from the outer court was the court for the women. So women and men could go in there, but women could go no further because the third court in was the court for the men, and only the men could go in there. Then after that was the holy place where only the priests could go, and beyond that was the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place where only the high priest could go, and that was only once a year on the Day of Atonement after special preparation. So there was a bit of a hierarchy in where people could go in the temple. And this woman was in the Court of Women, naturally, but the Court of Women was also the treasury where people came to put their offerings. So men and women could put offerings in because it was in the Court of Women. If it had been in the Court of Men, the women wouldn't have been able to put an offering in. And so here was this lady and other people giving their offerings. Now the treasury wasn't like, there was no online giving in those days. There was no little wooden box up the back where you could put your cash offering in. The treasury was big. There were 13 receptacles for putting offerings in, and they were described to be trumpet-shaped or a bit like an inverted megaphone. So you see a megaphone someone using at a sports carnival, you've got that sort of, shape, and there were 13 of them, and they were like inverted megaphones, and they were big. So it was quite a big thing, the treasury. And people came and put their offering in. And we read that Jesus was sitting there just watching what was going on. Well, what did this lady do? She came into the court of women, the treasury, and to put in her offering. And she had, we're told, 2 small coins, 2 small copper coins, worth a few cents, I think the translation which Susan read said. That's not very much. What's the smallest coin that we've got in our circulation? 5 cents. What could you buy with 5 cents? You can't even buy a lolly these days because lollies come in packets that you've got to buy more than one. And it was probably the lepton, which was a Greek coin, and it was, not worth very much. It was said to be 1/64th of a denarius, which was what a labourer in the farm, a farm labourer might get for a day's pay. If they worked the day, they might be given a denarius. And this lepton was about a 64th of that. So it wasn't very much because there was no basic wage then, there was no award wage. So, what they were getting paid per day was nothing like what you might have to get paid today. Say this lepton was worth maybe a few cents, but it might have had the buying power of, say, $1 today. Let's talk about it being $1. That's just a rough estimate of the buying power it might have. What can you buy with $1? A couple of apples if you're lucky. Not much at all, can you? She had 2 of them, 2 lepta, 2 little coins, and she went in with those. Now, I thought about what I would do if I was in her situation, and you think about what you would do in your situation. You got 2 coins. We're told that's all she had to live on for the day. So maybe she'd been out collecting crops, leftover crops, and she'd been able to sell them for that amount of money. We don't know how she got that money, but that was all she had. She had 2. It wasn't a 2 lepta coin, it was 2 separate leptons. She comes into the offering box. I think that I would probably put one in the offering and one in my pocket. And I think if you're honest, you'd probably do the same. But she put them both into the offering. There was no compulsion for her to do that. She just decided that was what she wanted to do. Compare her with the religious leaders who were coming in, and they had their long robes on. They used to pray a lot in the temple, and they prayed aloud and, showed off their long prayers, probably lots of long words in them as well. And they threw their $100 notes in the offering. They threw lots of money in, made a big show of it, and people looked at them and thought, wow, those religious leaders are giving a lot of money. In that passage which Susan read to us, before that, Jesus actually talks about these leaders. And I'll just read verse 38 from Mark 12. It says, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes, be greeted in the marketplaces, and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honour at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. Such men will be punished most severely." What's he talking about? They devour widows' houses. Well, some of the people he might have been referring to in the leaders, the teachers of the law, were the scribes. And the scribes were the lawyers of the day. And one of their roles was to look after widows' affairs. So if there was no family to sort of help in that, you might say today, probate, wills and all those things that happens when someone dies. So, and the lawyers of the day, the scribes, were entitled to take a payment for that service. It was their job. They were doing it. They were entitled to be paid. But some of them were exorbitant in the costs they charged. And Jesus is saying here they actually devoured widows' houses. They maybe took the whole house or made it to the extent where they had to sell and then had nowhere to live. So they had lots of money, but how did they obtain it? Well, that's where this lady was and what she did. But why? Why is this incident recorded? It's a small passage in both Mark and Luke. Why was it there? Why was it important? Because I think on the one hand, it shows the showmanship of leaders who liked people to praise them for their generosity. And the other hand, this widow who Jesus said gave so much more. The leaders wouldn't have missed the money they put in the offering. They made a big show of putting lots of money in. They weren't going to miss that. They had lots more. But in Jesus' eyes, even though she only gave those 2 little coins, she gave so much more. And she did it secretly. She didn't make a show of it. Probably only Jesus saw what she put in. Nobody else would have noticed. But it reflected her life's commitment to God. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul talks to the Corinthian church about the gifts that they're going to give to the church in Macedonia. And in chapter 9, he talks about, he says, each man should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Are we cheerful givers? So sometimes we do reluctantly give, don't we? We're not cheerful about it. And it says, not under compulsion. This lady was not under any compulsion to put those 2 coins in the offering box, but she did it because it reflected her life and it reflected her heart. And she trusted God that he would supply. This widow was a model of faith. She was totally dependent on God. You know, God didn't need those 2 small coins for the running of the temple and for the work that was done through the temple. He didn't need those 2 small copper coins. There was a lot more money in the offering than that. But he affirms her heart. You know, she gave what she couldn't afford. The others gave what they wouldn't even miss. And she gave her whole life. Matthew chapter 6 talks about giving. It talks in the context of prayer and earthly treasures. And Jesus says a lot about giving. He says, so when you give to the needy, don't announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honoured by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And a bit later in that chapter he says, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure